confusion of theories abound about what our sun is and how it operates. The theories affect how we can benefit from understanding the dynamics of the sun as we explore its operating principles. The science of the principles also enables us to see the future with greater certainty. Today's prevailing theories are built on many opinions. It becomes necessary, therefore, in exploring the truth, to separate what is demonstrably real from the landscape of educated opinions and the cultivated illusions, and that one does this in a comprehensive manner, because, ultimately, the subject is a single package. In the course of the exploration, the video introduces a number of revolutionary concepts that may seem surprising, but which are critical for a rational understanding of the dynamics of the solar system, of the nature of our sun as an energy source, for climate considerations, for energy production on Earth, and ultimately for a credible exploration of the Ice Age dynamics. Caution: this video may be disturbing to those who cherish the illusion of the sun being an invariable, internally powered, nuclear fusion star. The internal nuclear fusion theory of the sun, which is the generally accepted theory, has many flaws built into it, while no evidence actually exists that exclusively supports the theory. None whatsoever. That's shocking, isn't it? All historic and visible evidence supports instead the recognition of the sun as a plasma star that is externally powered with cold fusion nuclear synthesis occurring at its surface. This affects our climate, economics, politics, and how we relate to one another as human beings. When the truth becomes known, the world is changing. The old theories no longer apply. Recognized evidence discredits them. So what is wrong with the old theory about our sun? What is the theory saying to us? The general perception is that the sun is a sphere of atomic gas, mostly hydrogen, and some helium, and that within its core, at a calculated temperature of 15 million degrees Kelvin, at a gas density 150 times the density of water, nuclear fusion reactions do occur that generate vast amounts of energy by which the sun becomes a brilliantly radiant sphere in the sky that has burnt for billions of years with unchanging intensity, and will keep on burning for a few more billion years to come. The sun is theorized to fuse hydrogen atoms together in a chain of reaction by which helium atoms are produced, and some energy. The produced energy flux by mass is deemed to be equal to the energy generated by the metabolism of a human being. The extreme energy of the sun is deemed to be the result of energy accumulation derived from its great volume. That's the prevailing theory. But the theory doesn't add up, does it? The long-term climate history that has been discovered, the big ice age cycles that we have evidence of, and even the ice core records of the last ice age, with its gigantic short-term temperature oscillations that are evidenced in them, all tells us that the sun is anything but a constant star. The internal solar fusion theory does not allow for the enormous short and long-term fluctuations that we have evidence of. The theory tells us that the heat generated at the core of the sun by nuclear fusion takes a path of 30 million years to slowly ooze to the surface by convection, and that even the heat transmission by photons takes 10,000 to 170,000 years to reach the solar surface. By this slow process, the sun should be rock solid, unvarying. But it isn't. The sun's energy cycle is oscillating at an 11-year beat. Although its visible light output remains presently steady within 0.7%, in other parts of the spectrum its energy radiation varies by a factor of 20, that's a 2,000% difference. There are so many things coming to the surface in physical evidence which shouldn't happen under the internal fusion theory, but which do happen, so that they stand as evidence to indicate that the theory is evidently wrong. For example, it shouldn't be possible for the solar wind to accelerate against the force of gravity as the wind flows away from the sun. Likewise, it shouldn't be possible that the corona around the sun is hundreds of times hotter than the sun itself. However, these impossibilities all happen. The theoretical impossibilities of self-evident facts create paradoxes. Neither should it be possible that when we look at sunspots on the sun, and look through the umbra below the surface, that the sun is dark inside instead of being brilliantly radiant. However, as you can see yourself, below its shiny skin, the sun is dark. Is this a paradox? No, it isn't. What we see is precisely what the sun should be like, because nothing else is possible. It is impossible for the sun to be a gas sphere, which the internal nuclear fusion theory requires. By what is required for the standard solar theory, the sun should not exist. It is simply not possible for a gas sphere of the size of the sun to exist. The gravity pressure in a gas sphere of such an immense size would be so great that all atoms in its core would be crushed, instead of atoms being fused into larger atoms. A gas sphere of the size of the sun would be 1,000 times heavier than the sun is known to be. No rational theory, no matter how exotic, can bridge this impossible paradox. Just do some simple comparison. The gas planet Jupiter, at double the volume of Saturn, has double the mass density of Saturn. The doubling of the mass density results from the greater compression of the gas by the greater gravity, which the larger gas volume generates. This is what one would expect. The Sun, in the same comparison, has 1,000 times the volume of Jupiter, but it is known to have roughly the same mass density as Jupiter. That's not possible. The mass density of the Sun would be more than 1,000 times greater if it was a gas sphere. However, if the Sun was a plasma sphere, which is diffused by the repelling electric force that is inherent in plasma, the Sun's measured mass density is just about right. The resulting gigantic paradox renders the internal fusion sun theory, which depends on atomic hydrogen being fused into helium, to be totally wrong. Great efforts have been made to explain the impossible with exotic excuses, in order to rescue the false theory for which no evidence exists. Unfortunately, the process of shrouding paradox with exotic epicycles, for which no evidence exists either, is like saying to society, we really don't know how the thing works. We are guessing. The paradoxical theory is the best we can come up with. Of course, the paradoxical theory is the best theory possible if one proceeds from the premise that 99.999% of the universe does not exist, so that the theory of the functioning of the sun must be built on the 1,000th of a percent of the universe, which is allowed to be acknowledged by general perception. The result is a necessarily hopelessly narrow perception, the kind that is characteristic of fairy tales that are told to children at bedtime, to put them asleep. Researchers at the Los Alamos National Laboratory have come to the conclusion that the universe is not as empty as the fairy tale scripts make it out to be. Their recognition is that only 1,000th of a percent of the mass of the universe exists in atomic form, that the planets, moons, asteroids, interstellar gases, and so on, are made of. The researchers have come to the recognition that 99.999% of the mass of the universe, which is the portion that the fairy tales do not include, does indeed exist, and exist in the form of plasma. The ratio is probably much larger than 10,000 to 1, as the mass in plasma form includes the Sun, and every star in every galaxy, and includes also the vast streams of plasma in cosmic space that tie the stars and galaxies together across thousands of millions of light years in the cosmos. While plasma itself is invisible, being too small in size, the existence of giant plasma streams in cosmic space is discernible by their effects. For example, in cosmic space, we see the effects of the plasma streams in space in the alignment of stars and galaxies, often lined up in neat rows, like beads on a string. In the solar system, we see the effect of flowing plasma in the form of planets orbiting in an ecliptic. In the solar system, we see the effect of plasma streams as solar wind. But what is plasma? Plasma is the lifeblood of the universe. That's why it is called plasma. It is also the lifeblood of the Sun, which enables electric nuclear fusion at its surface layer. The Sun is a plasma star, with electric nuclear fusion occurring on its surface, that operates at low temperature. No other types of solar energy are physically possible, nor would there be a need for other types. Since electric plasma fusion on the surface of the Sun is the most efficient type of nuclear fusion possible, which operates at such low temperature as the Sun's 5,505 degrees, the principle is so efficient that it enables cold fusion at a mere 5,505 degrees Celsius. The process is driven by electric interaction, the interaction of one of the strongest forces in the universe. Plasma exists in the form of extremely small energized particles that are deemed to be themselves but constructs of energy. They carry both a quantity of mass and a specific electric charge. There are two main types of plasma particles recognized, a large type and a small type. The small type is named an electron. It carries a negative electric charge. The large type is named a proton. It is 1,000 times larger than the electron and has nearly 2,000 times more mass, and it carries a positive electric charge. As particles of mass, plasma particles gravitate towards one another by the effect of their mass, called gravity. The particles also affect one another by the electric force. Particles that are of complementary polarity, meaning opposite polarity, such as protons and electrons, attract one another by the electric force that is 39 orders of magnitude stronger than the force of gravity. Unlike by the effect of gravity, plasma particles do also repel one another by the electric force. This happens between particles of like polarity. However, the opposite happens when the particles come extremely close to one another, because the universe would not function without this additional principle. For example, when electrons become attracted to protons, they would ultimately latch onto one another so that nothing would move. After that, the electrons would simply remain stuck there. Nothing useful would result. But this doesn't happen. Nowhere in the universe can we find electrons latched onto protons. Before they would latch on, the electrons rebound. Instead of getting stuck, being latched onto the protons at close distances, electrons bounce away from the protons at close distances, like a rubber ball rebounds when it hits a wall. By this rebounding effect, even when they may not actually touch, electrons become drawn into an endless dance around the protons in plasma. They are attracted from afar and repelled at close distances, only to become attracted anew. The same principle may, on the large scale, cause a repulsive barrier to form against the electron dance past a specific plasma density, which keeps the electrons out of the dense plasma region, somewhat like oil floating on water. This means that the visible surface that we see isn't actually a surface in the standard sense, but is merely a density-determined zone where all the plasma interactions take place, including the fusion reactions that require a high electron density, in which the energetic processes that lead to fusion are easily motivated. The sun we see is not as we expect it to be. It is a creative atom synthesizing engine that is only skin deep. This means that when we look at the sun, what we see is in reality quite different than we imagine it to be. What we see is a thin active layer where electric interaction occurs, in which also nuclear fusion takes place with an inactive ball of plasma below the active layer. At the core of the plasma ball, some nuclear decay processes may occur that result when atomic structures drift down from the surface and become crushed by the dense plasma pressure, reverting back to the plasma state from which they were created on the surface. When the inflowing plasma streams become weak and become insufficient to maintain the required electron density for the electric interaction and the nuclear fusion to occur, the reactive layer will cease to function. It will simply cease to exist. A faint glow may remain, as some weak reactions may continue to occur. And at the deep center a bright zone may be found, caused by the fission reactions of nuclear decay. In its inactive state, our sun will likely become a white dwarf. Nuclear fusion happens on the surface of the sun, for as long as the sun remains in a healthy, electron-rich environment. When electrons become highly energized, the rapid movements of their dance around the proton has the effect that the electrons seem to be everywhere. When this happens, an atom is born, which would be a hydrogen atom, in the case of a single electron, swarming a single proton. The atom that is formed by this highly energetic dance is typically 100,000 times larger than the proton at the center of the dance, and is 1,000,000 times larger than the swarming electron itself. That gives the atom its effective form. The dynamic dance of electrons can be a swarm of one, or as many as 100 swarms of electrons arranged into rooms and layers of rooms, up to 7 levels deep, all contained within a single atom, which altogether give the atom its form. It may be the powerful dance of the electrons in the general plasma environment, which also accelerates the protons with them to the velocity needed for them to fuse, even to fuse into such large structures as the uranium nucleus. That required the fusion of 238 protons, some of which become converted into neutrons in the process of fusing. By the electric energetic interactions that produce such structures, some light energy and thermal energy is also being emitted in the process, as electrons are being attracted and repelled with great intensity. This means that the solar phenomenon, with all its features, depends absolutely on the horrendous dynamic dance of the electrons in the reaction cells on the surface of the Sun. Neutrons are created from a different type of close encounter effect than the rebounding of electrons. When two protons are forced towards each other with a greater force than their repelling electric force, at an extremely close distance the repelling force is reversed and becomes an attractive force instead, which snaps the two protons together. The energy that overcomes the repulsion, of course, has to be absorbed. It becomes absorbed by one of the protons that thereby loses its electric polarity. The joined proton becomes electrically neutral in the process. It becomes a neutron. By this change, the previous proton, now a neutron, remains latched onto a proton to form a larger unit. The neutron, essentially, acts like a glue between protons in a nucleus. By the process of protons becoming bundled together, it becomes possible for larger atoms to be formed that have several protons at their center, forming large clusters for the atomic nucleus. As in the case of uranium, where the entire large nucleus is being latched together with a large pile of neutrons that serve as glue for the giant package. In this manner, more than 100 different elementary atoms are being created on the solar surface. We find them arranged here in the periodic table of elements, according to their size, labeled by the number of protons contained in each package. Typically, the ratio of protons to neutrons is 1:1. In larger atoms, a greater ratio of neutrons is required to hold the big nuclei together. Evidently, more glue is needed there. However, in every case, the number of electrons in an atom matches the number of protons, whereby the electric fields inside an atom balance each other out. By this perfect equality, every resulting atom becomes electrically neutral. While it is possible for the swarming electrons of closely spaced atoms to share each other's space, which latch atoms together into molecules, and so on, the electric neutrality of the atomic structures remains always intact. The balancing act that creates electrically neutral packages, which all atoms and molecules are, is of critical importance for the universe to exist, and for us to exist. This electric balancing act is the heart that motivates everything. The electric balancing that creates electrically neutral atoms is one of the main factors why the cold fusion sun theory is possible, or for that matter, any atomic synthesizing fusion is possible. When an atom is formed that is electrically neutral, the repelling force that would keep the protons repelled from each other is suddenly neutralized. This means that far more protons, when joined to form atoms, can be packed into a given area, which otherwise would be able to hold only a minuscule portion of that mass, in the form of plasma, because in plasma the protons are repelling one another. In the unbound state, electric repulsion makes plasma extremely light and thinly diffused. In comparison, plasma bound into atoms is heavy, because the resulting package is smaller. Even the hydrogen atom is heavy in comparison with plasma, and of course, the helium atom is 4 times heavier still. The dense packaging of protons into atoms renders the internal solar nuclear fusion theory a fundamental impossibility. Because of the tight packing of atoms, a gas sphere the size of the Sun, filled with atoms of hydrogen and helium, would likely be 1,000 times heavier, if not more so, than the Sun actually is, if by some miracle such a heavy sphere is possible to exist. And if this mass density paradox was not enough, one also needs to consider that an even greater paradox exists as to where the hydrogen would have been produced that makes up a Sun, as required for the internal fusion theory. We have a paradox here, because the Sun is the only recognizable operating mechanism in the universe that causes the synthesis of atoms from plasma, including the hydrogen atom. Obviously, the Sun cannot produce itself. It cannot operate before it exists. The built-in hydrogen origin paradox is so great that it closes the door on any possibility of internal, solar, atomic fusion, to be anything but a dream enabled by another dream, the Big Bang Theory. This is also what we see when we look at the Sun, through the umbra of the sunspots on its surface. We see a Sun that is dark inside. We can see plainly that internal nuclear fusion isn't happening. The Sun would be brighter inside. We see exactly what we should see for a Sun, that is a sphere of thinly dispersed plasma. We see nothing. Plasma particles that are 100,000 times smaller than an atom are invisible. However, by looking at the Sun we can also see that the Sun is intensely energetic. If internal nuclear fusion is not possible, from where does the Sun derive its energy? The answer is simple. The Sun's energy is derived from plasma. Its energy is generated in the process of large-scale nuclear fusion happening on the surface of the Sun. The nuclear fusion process is such that it synthesizes all the atomic elements in the periodic table, in roughly the ratio of the known cosmic abundance. Evidently, the synthesizing atomic fusion is the most natural thing in the universe, and one of its most essential aspects. The free plasma gets consumed by the fusion process. The consumption creates a plasma sink that gets plasma moving. Plasma has no energy in itself, but becomes energetic when it is set in motion. And for plasma to move, we need a source and a sink it flows into. The cold fusion process is this sink. It is not enough for the Sun to have plasma to flow to it, to energize it. The flow process needs a sink to function. The fusing of protons into electrically neutral atoms creates such a sink. If plasma would merely flow into the Sun to energize it, it would simply pile up there and nothing would happen. Plasma needs to flow to be energetic, just like water needs to flow for hydroelectric generating systems to work. For hydroelectric generating to work, water needs to flow from the high point, the source, to a low point. The energy of the water, flowing from a high point, pulled by the force of gravity, delivers the energy that turns the turbine. The energy that is generated on the Sun must have similar potential. It must have a source and a sink for an energetic flow to happen. On the Sun, these conditions are met. The nuclear fusion process energizes the dynamics that also create energy in the form of light and heat. The synthesizing fusion on the surface of the Sun literally eats up plasma, packs it together, and spits it out as electrically neutral atoms that flow away with the wind. Without this process of the Sun eating plasma, nothing would happen. Nothing would flow. The process may be termed cold fusion, as the process is not initiated by intense thermal agitation in the range of millions of degrees, but by cold magnetic plasma acceleration and plasma pressure that produce a modest amount of thermal and light energy along the way, at a surface temperature of 5,505 degrees Celsius. The universe is motivated by the plasma sink process. Since the need for the sink feature is not readily apparent, allow me to illustrate it by comparing the plasma flow system with a water supply system. Water supply systems typically have a faucet installed. When one opens the faucet, water flows. When this happens, the water in the system flows across the entire length of the supply system, all the way to the source, that may be a lake high in the mountains. In such a system, the open faucet becomes a type of sink that enables the water to flow. With the faucet open, water flows throughout the entire length of the pipeline system. With the faucet closed, nothing flows anywhere. Now, let's look at an extreme example. In the process of creating the uranium atom, 238 protons were fused together to form the central nucleus. Before the protons were fused, they were a part of the plasma environment and were repelling each other. They were a force that held up the plasma density. After the atom was formed, the 238 protons were no longer a part of the electric environment that adds to the plasma pressure. The forming of the atom left behind a vacuum, as it were, in the plasma landscape. Of course, the vacuum is quickly filled with inflowing plasma. In this manner, a significant rate of flow is created in the movement of plasma that becomes reflected throughout the entire system of plasma streams, reaching far back into interstellar space. Interstellar plasma streams are evidently set in motion by this consuming plasma fusion process that becomes a dynamic sink. This plasma sink is needed. Without a sink, no flow is happening. Now when plasma flows in interstellar space, the magnetic fields produced by the electric flow draw the plasma streams closer together by what is called the Lorentz force. Of course, when the plasma streams are drawn together, the pinching of them into a smaller cross-section increases the plasma density. The increased plasma density, in turn, increases the magnetic fields, which in turn pinches the current ever tighter. The self-feeding process forms the geometry of a bowl-type structure at the highest density point. The magnetic fields become intensely tangled up there, whereby the bowl-shaped end opens up and enables plasma to escape. The node points would logically occur near a plasma sink, which motivates the plasma flow in the first place. Let's assume that the plasma sink is our Sun, as the center of the system. In this case, the bowl-shaped magnetic fields would be focused onto our Sun. Normally, interstellar plasma streams are not visible, but in a few extremely high-powered examples, such as in the Red Square Nebula, some parts of the bowl-shaped geometry become visible, especially in the areas of the highest concentration. Contrary to general perception, nebulae are not exploding stars, but are high-power electromagnetic structures. Also, a number of unique features of the electromagnetic bowl-type structure itself become recognizable in the Red Square Nebula. The plasma researcher David LaPointe has extensively explored the nature of the magnetic fields of bowl-shaped magnetic structures, which he has termed primer fields. He identified 3 unique magnetic features. He has identified what he calls a confinement dome, a flip ring, and a choke ring. The flip ring is a magnetic ring that flips the incoming plasma stream upwards under the confinement dome, where plasma becomes concentrated. The concentrated plasma becomes focused downward by the choke ring that focuses the concentrated plasma onto a Sun that acts as a sink for the plasma flow. All 3 features are visible in the Red Square Nebula. The features that we see in the Red Square Nebula correspond with what David LaPointe has been able to replicate in the laboratory. The features also match in principle the resulting plasma shapes observed in high-energy plasma flow experiments conducted at the Los Alamos National Laboratory by Anthony Peyrat, Director of Experiments. In electrodynamic systems, the flow of electricity is critical. It is always the flow of electricity that creates magnetic fields. No other cause for magnetic effects exist. By the resulting magnetic fields, the electric plasma streams become aligned, they become pinched together, and become increasingly concentrated by the magnetic fields in such a manner that a high-density plasma sphere forms around a sink object, like our Sun is. By this process, the plasma surrounding our Sun becomes so dense that electric fusion reactions occur at the Sun's surface, in an intensely concentrated form, magnetically confined by the primer fields. And that is precisely what causes our Sun to become a sink for interstellar plasma, which it must be in order to motivate the flow of plasma into it. For a closer look, we need to look at the Sun's surface. When the Sun is observed with an optical telescope, the Sun is seen as a vast sea of granular cells, which sometimes break down, leaving sunspots in the wake. Since the Sun is powered on its surface by electric plasma interaction, the granules are themselves cells of primer fields in operation on a relatively small scale. The cells are typically 1,000 kilometers across. This means that the surface of the Sun is a vast sea of cellular primer field structures, all operating side by side, with each having its own flip ring and confinement dome. And here again, the inflowing plasma, that is at this stage highly concentrated around the Sun, becomes even more extremely concentrated under each cell's confinement dome. In this case, the plasma becomes so immensely concentrated under the confinement dome that nuclear fusion occurs. It is this resulting nuclear fusion process that causes the Sun to act as a plasma sink. Without the fusion process on the surface of the Sun, which synthesizes all atoms, the Sun could not be powered with external energy. The reactions would not occur. Nothing would flow. However, when atoms are formed, previously electrically active plasma particles become so tightly packed and balanced that they become electrically neutral. They cease to exist in the electric system. By being no longer tied to anything, the synthesized atoms simply flow away with the solar wind. With this process of electric atomic synthesis, a powerful sink effect is created. In addition, all the elements that exist, that the planets are made of, were, and are created by this process. Instead of the pp chain of fusion, that is theorized for the internally heated Sun, which ends at the helium-4 stage, no such limit is inherent in the plasma-powered surface fusion process. The synthesis extends far beyond the helium fusion stage. The evidence that a wide range of surface fusion is happening is found in the remarkably close agreement of the measured element ratios on the surface of the Sun, shown on black, with the known cosmic abundance ratio for the same elements in the solar system, shown on white. What is glaringly missing in both abundance charts is the helium-3 that is deemed critical in the theorized pp internal solar fusion theory, and is deemed to be a major component of it. Thus, the missing helium-3 adds another factor to the many factors that invalidate the internal solar fusion theory. In addition, the pp solar fusion theory does not allow for the synthesis of the heavier elements above the helium stage. The heavier elements, past the helium stage, should therefore not be present in the atmosphere of the Sun at all. None should be there. Still, they have all been measured there. Their presence, that shouldn't be, invalidates the internal fusion theory still further. The presence of heavy elements in the solar atmosphere proves the electric surface fusion concept, which alone enables atomic synthesis to be possible on the Sun, in a process in which atoms are fused directly from plasma, by which all the known elements in the periodic table are created. If the heavy elements were synthesized in the core of the Sun, these elements would have accumulated and become the core, a heavy core, which the Sun does not have, and cannot have. This paradox is not possible on the external fusion platform. The missing helium-3 in the solar atmosphere suggests that the helium-3 that is abundant on the Moon did not come from the Sun at all, but was forged on the Moon by the effect of high-energy cosmic ray particles fissioning off a neutron from the helium-4 atoms or from elements made of alpha particles that thereby fission. Intense cosmic ray showers are natural on the Moon that has no atmosphere. The existence of helium-3 on the Moon does not suggest that helium-3 is a useful fusion fuel. Experiments have illustrated that the opposite is true. That strong fusion synthesis is happening on the surface of the Sun is also evident on Earth. It is evident by the existence of noctilucent clouds high in the stratosphere. We see rivers of water vapor present there, frozen into ice crystals that were evidently not lifted up from the surface into the stratosphere, but came from the Sun, carried by the solar winds. Cold fusion drives the universe. Electric fusion on the surface of the Sun is cold fusion. It is enabled by magnetic plasma compression and is maintained by the sink effect of the fusion itself. The heating of the photosphere is a subsequent phenomenon. It is comparatively minuscule, at 5,505 degrees Celsius. All the nuclear fusion experiments on Earth are based on the illusion that the fusion process inside the Sun, which the experiments aim to replicate, require those 15 million degrees that are theorized to exist in the Sun for the internal heating. That is deemed to violently agitate the atoms that are to be fused. For this reason, all fusion experiments on Earth are hot fusion experiments, even though hot fusion doesn't actually happen on the Sun, and likely nowhere in the universe either. Cold nuclear fusion is the fusion that has created all the elements that the planets are made of. The atoms in the universe are not the result of a primordial Big Bang, but are the product of cold-powered fusion that is motivated by the electric force and is maintained by the fusion process itself, which creates an electric sink by plasma electricity becoming bottled up and neutralized within the package of the atom. It is not unreasonable, therefore, to assume that all the atomic elements in the solar system, which the planets are made of, which together make up 14/100th% of the mass of the solar system, were all born on the surface of the Sun, in a nuclear fusion process that creates atomic structures. The remaining 99.86% of the mass of the solar system is plasma located in the Sun. This means that atomic elements are extremely rare in the universe, even though they are the heart of the world in which we live. Every element of our world was synthesized on the Sun over time. And that's a lot. This means that the synthesizing system that produces the vast abundance of different atomic elements that make up our world must nevertheless be enormously efficient. The great efficiency is rooted in the dynamics of electrically motivated cold fusion that creates its own sink. The cold fusion process in the Sun is simple. All protons repel each other strongly by the electric force that is one of the basic forces of the universe. Each proton also packs a substantial mass that is roughly 2,000 times greater than the mass of an electron. When energy is invested into putting the mass of a proton into motion, and this kinetic energy becomes great enough to overcome the electric repulsion, the two protons will snap together. They will fuse together. As the protons fuse, some of the kinetic energy becomes loaded into one of the fusing protons. The proton becomes transformed thereby. It becomes transformed by the process into a neutron. The resulting neutron carries no electric charge. As the result of this fusion process, the electric field of one of the joining protons simply ceases to exist. The resulting field reduction has a dramatic effect on a plasma stream, where all the protons repel one another, as in the case shown here. The total field effect is cut in half. However, the overall repelling effect that affects the plasma density is much more dramatically reduced. The resulting shock of the vanishing field and repulsion effect creates a partial void in the plasma pressure, which the adjoining protons are propelled to fill. Thus, the fusion effect creates some highly energized movement in the plasma stream, which further aids the fusion process. The resulting voids accelerate the flow process, as if one had opened a water faucet more fully. This process is self-escalating. The more protons are joined, the more neutrons are created, and the greater the void in the repelling electric field becomes, which in turn accelerates the process. This means that the faucet is effectively opened more and more, the stronger the process flows. Nor does it end here. As more protons are being used up, by becoming neutrons that have no electric effect, the ratio between the remaining protons and the electrons in the plasma stream suddenly doubles, and in some cases triples. As the fused proton-neutron clusters are joined to one another themselves, forming ever larger clusters, the overall electron density surrounding the larger clusters is thereby increasing ever more, to the point that the electrons, too, become bound up by the now increasing field strength of the accumulating nuclei. When this happens, the result is even more dramatic. When the electric charge of the electrons balance the charge of the remaining protons, the entire electric scene becomes a void. All protons and electrons in the entire atomic construction lose their overall electric field potential, as if they had vanished from their universe. The void is so great that substantial plasma streams are drawn into it. In this manner, the electric nuclear fusion synthesis creates a bottomless pit that heats up electric fields in plasma. This bottomless pit sucks up plasma as atomic elements emerge. In comparison, the waterline carries the plasma streams. The faucet is the fusion process that the plasma flows into. Out of the faucet comes a stream of assembled atoms that are electrically neutral and dissipate into the landscape. In the process, the faucet gets exceedingly hot. The energy that drives it comes from the potential created by the plasma sink. The same principle applies here that drives a hydroelectric generating plant, powered by the pressure differential between the reservoir surface level and the discharge level. From hydroelectric plants, the generated energy is carried away by electric transmission lines. From the sun, the process heat is radiated as light and heat, enabling life to be. Solar fusion is cold fusion. We should replicate it. Cold fusion, as we see the principle applied on the sun, is the most efficient energy producer in the universe. It is anti-entropic in nature, with a resource that is self-renewing. Cold fusion is efficient as a solar process because its active component is self-accelerating. Thereby, large amounts of energy and atomic elements are generated with relative ease on the solar surface. Nothing is forced there. Everything happens naturally. The sink effect is so efficient in accelerating plasma that the millions of degrees in thermal energy that all fusion experiments on Earth require to force atoms to fuse together are not required on the sun at all. The sun operates with a cold fusion process in which thermal and light energy is produced as a secondary effect by the mechanics of the process. All of the current artificial nuclear fusion power processes fail because they fail to utilize the critical sink principle that motivates cold fusion. They employ enormously large external forces in an effort to break the electric repulsion barrier that develops between approaching atomic nuclei once the electron shells are penetrated. The kind of agitation of atoms that breaks this barrier requires enormous energies. And even with that, efficient fusion has not yet been achieved, even with such giant efforts as are made at the National Ignition Facility, and this with the most ideal fusion fuel. Most of the fusion experiments use two types of overbuilt atomic isotopes, deuterium and tritium, that are violently forced to fuse. When they do fuse, one of the overbuilt isotopes carries a redundant neutron that in the process of fusing the end product becomes unbound. When this happens, the previously invested binding energy becomes liberated. This liberated energy is intended to be used to power electricity generating systems. The attempted power production processes all invariably fail because the intended fusion process does not aim for the natural sink effect, but forces results with the injection of brute agitation for which enormous energies are expended to generate the agitation. Consequently, it takes radically more energy as input to operate such a process than the result gives back. The inherent inefficiency that results from substituting the natural sink principle with brute force renders nuclear fusion power production on Earth a hopeless proposition. This failure in principle stands in addition to all the other problems associated with the projects that render the hope for success an empty dream. When it is being said that terrestrial nuclear power projects aim to replicate the process that powers the sun, a fundamental error is incurred because what is being replicated in experiments does not really occur naturally on the sun as a process. The actually operating solar processes are infinitely more efficient than what the experiments aim for. The natural solar processes that are actually in operation on the sun are not utilized for power production anywhere on Earth, experimentally or otherwise, for the simple reason that they are deemed not to exist. This does not mean that the real solar energy processes will never be replicated on Earth. Not necessarily. Plenty of evidence exists that cosmic electric plasma surrounds the Earth in a pattern that is also visible on the sun. On Earth, a plasma flow pattern is visible in the ionosphere. The enormous electric potential that is visible here appears to be carrying the driving energy for a long list of natural processes on Earth. Among the electric systems powered from the ionosphere are hurricanes, lightning, and tornadoes, whenever thermal events create a sufficient connection to the ionosphere. We can step up to the plate and participate in the utilization of the cosmic power system, and beyond that, by replicating on Earth the cold fusion principle that the Sun has utilized for its past billions of years. The nuclear fusion, as a synthesizing fusion, will power the economies of humanity. Then the old saying will have a new meaning attached, that the sky is not a limit. The Alfvén wave oscillations are one of the paradoxes in solar physics based on the theory of the internally heated sun, but which are expected in electric solar physics. Resonant oscillations are a common phenomenon in all plasma electric systems. The Alfvén wave phenomenon is one of them. If a conducting fluid, like plasma, is perturbed within a constant magnetic field, motion of the fluid produces electric currents. The magnetic field created by the electric currents give rise to mechanical forces that affect the motion of the conducting fluid, such as plasma or liquid water. With a combined effect, an electromagnetic hydrodynamic wave is generated. With this discovery, the science of magnetohydrodynamics was born that earned the Swedish electrical engineer Hannes Alfvén the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1970. Alfvén waves, in the form of plasma waves, have been observed in the Sun's corona with the propagation speeds in the range of 200 to 250 kilometers per second. The concentric nature of the waves, illustrated here, suggests that the resonance is inherent in the Sun itself as a sphere of plasma and is electromagnetically propagated outward. The Alfvén wave phenomenon is sometimes believed, for the lack of a better idea, to be the cause of the high temperatures that occur in the Sun's corona, which can reach 2 to 3 million degrees. During a total solar eclipse, the corona surrounding the Sun can be seen by the naked eye, but in the standard internal fusion theory, it poses a huge problem. It should not be possible under this theory for plasma that is deemed to flow from the Sun to be up to 450 times hotter than the Sun itself. In the electric Sun, the seeming paradox does not exist, because the plasma in the corona does not originate with the Sun at all. Interstellar plasma streams are focused around the Sun by the primary primer fields. The concept has been verified by static plasma experiments by David Lapointe and by high-energy dynamic experiments by Anthony Beirut at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. The superheated corona can be seen as the external layer of plasma focused onto the Sun by the primer fields. The extreme heating that is evident does not come from the Sun itself, but results from the dense concentration of the incoming energy that is confined magnetically, spatially, and kinetically. The process of concentration intensifies the thermal environment. The corona is not the solar wind. The solar wind tunnels through the corona in a process that accelerates it explosively. Under the standard theory, the acceleration of the solar wind is a paradox. It should not be possible for particles flowing away from the Sun, against the Sun's enormous force of gravity, to accelerate as they move away, much less to reach speeds up to 800 kilometers per second. Still, this impossible happens. In plasma solar physics, the phenomenon is not a paradox. It is expected. It would be surprising if it didn't happen. When plasma becomes highly concentrated under the magnetic confinement domes of the reaction cells on the surface of the Sun, and the plasma pressure under the dome exceeds the confinement field strength, some of the highly compressed plasma leaks through the confinement field and is suddenly free to expand. When plasma is compressed, it is compressed against the repelling force of the protons to one another. When the pressure is released, the repelling force drives the entire complex apart explosively. This means that the green protons would push each other apart with the strongest long-reaching force in the universe, the electric force. As a result, the spaces between them become larger, as in the blue example, and then larger again, as in the purple example. However, fast-moving plasma generates a magnetic field that keeps the flowing stream narrowly concentrated, somewhat like a lightning bolt. The magnetic field tunnels through the corona, while the plasma particles push each other apart, further and faster, like a bullet is fired through the barrel of a gun, propelled by exploding gas. The difference is that plasma is propelled in this case by the repelling electric force. These dramatic aspects of evidence take us far away from the currently accepted theory of the internally heated, nuclear fusion-powered sun. We have also still larger items of evidence before us of the sun being externally powered. While the physical features of this evidence can no longer be seen, some related evidence exists that suggests strongly that some gigantic visible features of large-scale plasma flow phenomena did exist of the type that can only be experimentally replicated at the present time, in laboratory experiments. One aspect of evidence of large-scale plasma flow phenomena is found in the Giza pyramids. The most perplexing feature of the pyramids is the amazing accuracy of their alignment with the line of the Earth's meridian that no one can actually see. The baseline of the pyramids is aligned with this invisible geographic orientation with an accuracy of 4 minutes of arc, by which the Giza pyramids are the most accurately aligned structures in the world. How could this amazing accuracy have been achieved when the reference line for it is invisible? The evident answer is that the reference line was likely visible at the time when the pyramids were built. Researchers discovered that the orientation of the Sphinx such that it would have faced its image in the stars, the constellation Leo, roughly 12,800 years ago. This alignment suggests that the pyramids were built at this time. This distant time frame coincides exactly with the start of the gigantic rewarming of the Earth that marks the end of the last ice age and the start of the present interglacial period. If one utilizes the experiment-derived, magnetically shaped dynamic flow geometry, which is shown here as an example for what may have been visible in the night sky in ancient times, and this would have been likely the case when the powerful rewarming of the Earth began, then a reference would have been established in the sky that would have enabled the builders to accurately align their pyramids with that clearly visible reference that would have indicated the meridian line. With the sun just below the horizon, the visible geometry in the night sky, at the time when the geometry is perfectly vertical, would mark the geographic pole of our planet and the direction of the meridian against which the pyramids could have been aligned with the extreme accuracy that has been achieved. Experiments have indicated that the plasma structure in the sky would be perfectly perpendicular to the ecliptic plane when it became visible in times of strong plasma currents, thus providing a celestial reference line that can no longer be seen today in today's weak electric environment. The idea of the pyramid itself might have been derived from features of the plasma structure that might have been seen incorporated into the geometry. A further example of once visible features becoming experimentally discovered as geometry in plasma flows is found replicated amazingly accurately in the layout of the Stonehenge monument. The Stonehenge features might have been visible during the interglacial optimum from a high longitude position. Some recently discovered features in high-energy plasma flow were evidently visible in the sky and were replicated in the form of a large monument. It has been discovered in high-power plasma flow experiments that strongly moving plasma streams become magnetically aligned into 56 evenly spaced filaments, or in lesser streams to fractions of this number, as it is seen in the case on the cross-section view of a plasma stream that is erroneously termed supernova 1987A. The plasma flow experiment that yielded the full complement of 56 filaments matches amazingly closely the basic layout of the Stonehenge monument. The position of the 56 plasma filaments matches the relative position of the monument's 56 obere holes amazingly accurately, which are believed to have served as sockets for a circle of large wooden poles. The close agreement of the construction of the monument with experiment-derived features of geometry suggests that these features were once seen in the night sky, possibly during the interglacial maximum, when the plasma flow through the solar system would have been strong. We are presently at a deep low point on the solar intensity scale, so that the plasma features that were evidently once visible are no longer visible. In fact, we are presently approaching the point that familiar features that are visible today, such as the solar winds, may, in the near future, no longer be seen. Modern instrumentation has made it possible for gigantic plasma features to be seen that, in spite of their size, have remained invisible before. One of the newly detected features are two gigantic plasma structures that extend perpendicularly from the heart of the Milky Way galaxy across a distance of 25,000 light-years. Long before the plasma structure became visible, the plasma explorer Hannes often theorized that the discovered type of electric dynamics must exist as a causative force that corresponds with the known geometric features of the galaxies. While many theories exist to interpret the phenomenon that NASA has discovered with advanced instrumentation, the only laboratory experiment that I know of that replicates in principle the observed phenomenon in the small is the primer fields geometry derived from high-energy experiments at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, conducted by Anthony Peyrat. The experiment-derived geometry illustrates the galactic plasma structures as magnetically confined concentrations of high-density plasma under what David LaPointe refers to as the confinement dome, which he explored in detail in static laboratory experiments. The magnetic bowl structure that channels the intergalactic plasma streams under the confinement domes of the Milky Way galaxy is evidently too weak to be visible by instrumentation. However, the larger magnetic field structure that creates the confinement domes is evident by its effect that pinches the galaxies into a magnetically aligned flat disk. The bowl-type magnetic field structure may be much larger than the experiment-derived geometry illustrates. The field may be as wide as the galaxy itself. The intergalactic plasma streams are only visible by the effect of their function. The effect is visible in the existence of groups arranged as strings of galaxies, lined up like beads on a string, often with equal spacing between them, which links groups of galaxies into single dynamic phenomena. The string-like groups are visible everywhere, as far as our telescopes can reach. In some cases, the interconnecting plasma streams are strong enough to be faintly visible. Another evidence of the intergalactic current structure is evident in the oscillations in Phanerozoic climate on Earth that has been explored going back 500 million years. Two long oscillations are apparent here, one in beats of slightly over 140 million years in duration, and the shorter in beats of roughly 62 million years. These two extremely long beats reflect the type of long resonance cycles that one would expect to occur in intergalactic plasma streams. All plasma flows have their built-in resonance. The inbound and outbound plasma resonances become combined in the galaxy, which result in the mutually overlaid cycles of the Phanerozoic climate oscillations. Some of the overlaid oscillations combine in a manner that give us the major historic ice age epochs. In plasma physics applied to cosmology, where plasma is typically not visible, as its particles are too small to be seen, one needs to see the cause of the dynamics gleaned from the effects. This applies to both the very large phenomena in intergalactic space and the very small phenomena in interplanetary space, and that of solar systems. The modern ice age cycles that have been upon us in the weaker galactic environment are evidently small, local phenomena of electric discharge resonances in interstellar plasma streams, which give us a few interglacial holidays in the otherwise deep glacial environment. By understanding the principles involved, it becomes possible to accurately forecast the future climate of our planet, not defined by events, but by the principles for the events, and to prepare the world in accord with it to assure the survival of humanity. The solar wind is one of the major yardsticks that we have available with which to judge how well funded the solar fusion process operates at a given time. This process that synthesizes atoms from plasma on the Sun provides the sink effect for the plasma flow. Atoms are the only structures in the universe that are electrically neutral. The solar synthesizing fusion, a form of cold fusion that binds plasma particles into electrically neutral structures, creates physical elements that no longer react as a part of the electric power system. The thereby bound plasma particles, which produce the atoms, essentially disappear from the electric landscape, as if they had vanished from their universe, which in a sense they have, while they physically remain to exist. So, what happens to these electrically neutral fusion products in real terms? Do they clog up the works? Do they flow away with the solar wind? These questions are questions of principle. Typically, the electrically neutral fusion products get blown along with the solar winds. But why do the solar winds blow, and what happens when they no longer blow? In earlier times, when the solar system was born, the atoms flowing in the solar wind were drawn together by gravity in a process of accretion that formed the planets in the first place, and also all the moons. The solar wind provides the distribution service that makes this happen. It also appears to purge the fusion reaction cells on the Sun of the fusion product. In addition, the solar wind also fulfills a highly critical function of a different type. It is a part of an efficient plasma pressure regulating system that keeps the Sun operating at a steady state. The regulating feature produces the solar wind. When the plasma pressure under the confinement domes on the Sun's surface exceeds the pressure that the magnetic dome can contain, the excess plasma escapes through the confinement dome in a fine jet, or numerous jets. The jets merging together become the solar wind. This means that for as long as the solar winds blow, there is enough plasma pressure under the confinement dome to keep the fusion process going. However, when the input streams diminish to below the minimal plasma pressure for solar winds to form, a lot of effects evidently begin to happen. The rate of fusion reaction diminishes. With it, the sink effect becomes diminished. This reduces the plasma rate of flow, which in turn reduces the fusion reactions, which in turn reduces the plasma rate of flow further. When the plasma flow diminishes, the primer fields diminish with it, which reduces the plasma flow still further. On this path, the entire system can shut itself down rapidly and almost without warning. In addition to all that, the diminishing solar winds reduce the purging of the fusion products of the synthesized atoms from the fusion reaction cells. If the fusion products clog up, they diminish the reaction process even more. It is unknown how critical the purging of the synthesized atoms from the reaction cells is. It may be more critical than we believe it to be. One of the biggest problems that nuclear fusion reactor experiments have encountered on Earth is that their fusion product elutes the fusion fuel, which eventually stops the fusion process. The longest duration of continuous fusion achieved so far, a type of world record, has been in the range of less than a second at full power and 5 seconds at a third of the rated power output. The giant ITER fusion reactor that is being built in Europe as a follow-on experiment as an international project is expected to achieve a whopping 1,000-second fusion burn by continuously purging the fusion product from the reaction chamber. On the Sun, the solar wind appears to fulfill the purifying function. It is unclear to what degree the solar wind may diminish without it having a detrimental impact on the fusion reactions in the cells. It could be that the solar fusion system may collapse even before the solar wind pressure diminishes to 0%. That's something to keep in mind. When the atom synthesizing process slows, the sink effect diminishes. In this case, the reduced sink effect reduces the plasma flow rate, which in turn reduces the magnetic fields. The entire system becomes affected thereby in a chain reaction negative feedback loop, whereby the entire, deeply interlocked electromagnetic system may collapse and vanish as if it had never existed. The Sun becomes inactive when the primer fields collapse. It loses 70% of its energy. The Sun goes dim. We have plenty of evidence of such radical events occurring, preserved in the ice of Greenland from the last ice age. However, the solar wind also tells us something else. As a carrier of the atoms synthesized on the sun, the solar wind also tells us that if we should ever care to utilize the solar fusion sync process for energy production on Earth, we may be able to tune the fusion part of the process to synthesize any atomic element we care to create. NASA's Ulysses satellite gave us a big boost in understanding our universe. It gave us more than just a way of looking at the sun from all latitudes. Ulysses gave us the most pristine view of the solar wind patterns that we can get. It took measurements in areas far away from the ecliptic plane, where the heliospheric current sheet throttles the solar wind. It measured the solar wind speed outside the ecliptic at just below 800 kilometers per second, which we don't see in near-Earth space. This suggests that it would be wonderful if the Ulysses I around the sun had not been scrapped in 2009. Nevertheless, the measurements that it has provided gave us enough valuable benefits for evaluating the solar wind measurements that we do get from satellites orbiting in near-Earth space, in ecliptic space, where the measurements are affected by the heliospheric current sheet. Ulysses saw the solar wind pressure diminished at the ecliptic from 4 nanopascals in the white circle to 2.5 nanopascals in the green circle for the first orbit, and from 2.5 nanopascals to 1 for the third orbit. While the numbers are lower near the ecliptic and the green circle, the ratio between them remains essentially the same. This means that the solar wind measurements that we are able to make in near-Earth space provide us with enough data to render the solar wind data a useful thermometer for judging the health of the solar system. This means that the critical judgments that we must make in our time to determine the start of the next ice age are not severely impacted by the termination of the Ulysses mission. For example, if the mission would continue, we would not see any changes in the polar region where the sun has its connection with the plasma streams from the primer fields, which the solar wind is too puny to penetrate. This also means that the diminishing trend of the solar winds towards the solar cutoff that Ulysses saw the beginning of can still be detected with contemporary instrumentation operating inside the ecliptic plane. The current observations have not significantly altered the potential that the solar cutoff might happen in the 2050 time frame, and that the solar winds might cease before this time. Ironically, the potential event itself is actually not the most critical factor for our consideration. The principles are important. The principles make the potential event significant, because the recognition of the principles inspire the imperatives for action. The discovery of principles is rooted in the higher nature of man, that is able to guide us in uplifting our world in preparation for the needs of the future regardless of the unpredictable timing of events. There are many principles in operation right now that are largely ignored as insignificant events, but which, when seen in the context of the larger package, illustrate the dynamics that precipitate events. The dynamics of the sunspots can be seen in this manner as aspects of sensitive electrodynamic phenomena. When sunspots speak to us, we can observe the sunspot principle in action every day, the principle that produces sunspots. Sunspots are voids on the solar surface. They result from localized disruptions of the dynamics of the primer fields that enable the reactive processes on the solar surface. The vast landscape of a multitude of small cellular field structures that covers the entire surface of the sun sometimes breaks down in localized regions, occasionally one cell at a time, but usually in groups, which leaves behind dark holes on the surface. The resulting dark areas where the breakdown occurs are termed sunspots. Sunspots frequently occur bunched together in groups across a region. The reason for this localized collapse of reaction cells across a region appears to be the buildup of back pressure in the region below the cells. The entire region around the sunspot group appears to be slightly brighter in the photograph, as one would expect to see for a region with more intense fusion activity. The difference in brightness is small, but it is visible. The resulting increased back pressure may be caused by the increased concentration of synthesized atoms that tend to insulate the electric field connection with the sun's interior, below the reaction cells. Thus, ironically, the occurrence of sunspots is an indication of high levels of fusion activity going on, both in general and specifically in the area of the slightly brighter sunspot region. That the back pressure limits the plasma current flow rate, and thereby reduces the strength of the magnetic fields that concentrate the plasma and cause the fusion reaction cells to function, is evident in the occurrence of regional sunspot groups, and the occurrence of single-cell failures in the regions of the large sunspots. When active magnetic primer fields diminish, the plasma back pressure blows out around them, or escapes through the resulting hole in the magnetic carpet when active cells collapse. The escaping plasma streams are seen as plasma loops, and in larger cases, as giant prominences. They become visible by the presence of atoms in their stream that has caused the back pressure. Pure plasma is invisible. It becomes visible only by its effects on the atomic elements that are 100,000 times larger than the plasma particles which pervade the atmosphere and are moved along with the plasma streams. In most cases, the escaping back pressure does not collapse the cells completely, but escapes around them. In such cases, the escaping plasma forms thin streams that loop back onto the sun, guided by the magnetic fields that their flow is generating, which are interacting with the much weaker background magnetic fields in a particular region of the sun's surface. Active cells collapse rarely, so that sunspots result only under extreme conditions. Giant eruptions, such as the prominence shown here, are extremely rare. They typically occur when the plasma pressure inside the sun, as plasma is being pumped into it by the primer fields, exceeds the external plasma pressure. The occurrences of prominences, or solar flares, typically follow the trend of the solar cycles. The reduced solar flare index, shown in green, which was the most dramatically affected of all the indexes when the electric environment began to weaken, may well be the best thermometer for measuring the electric health of the solar system. Plasma is a near-perfect electric conductor. As a plasmasphere, the sun soaks up plasma somewhat like a sponge that stores up whatever plasma streams flow into it through the reaction cells past the nuclear fusion processes. The injection of plasma is a dynamic and widely distributed process. However, the injection of plasma increases the plasma pressure inside the sun, below the electron concentration layer and the surface reactions. The pressure building up needs to be constantly vented via small or large solar mass ejection events, or solar flares, as they are also called. The dynamics are poorly understood, even though these ejection events are often feared on Earth, as they disrupt radio communications, electricity transmission systems, and cause earthquakes. In real terms, however, solar flares, like sunspots, only more so, are a sign of good health for the sun and for its operating dynamics. When the solar flares dramatically diminish or no longer occur, then we have cause to be concerned. And they are diminishing, as we see it in solar cycle 23, in the flare index, for the first time since the index was developed. The sunspots numbers are somewhat less dramatically affected by the diminishing energy environment in the solar system. Still, they are useful as a strong indicator of unfolding trends. Nevertheless, from a science standpoint, the sunspots are extremely valuable. They are valuable in that they provide a portal through which we can see deep into the interior of the sun, which, as I said in the beginning, is substantially darker below the active surface layer. This means that the reaction process on the surface of the sun is only skin deep. The dark interior reveals itself as essentially a sphere of plasma that furnishes merely the supportive electric environment for the surface reactions to happen. The sunspots also provide us a portal to the remaining intensity of the sun, when the reaction cells collapse globally as the external primer fields collapse that focus plasma onto the sun. The recognition of the sun as a plasma sphere is critical for our determining its residual powering during its inactive state. The gravitational force that the giant mass of the Sun generates, even with its small mass density, is so great that atomic structures, regardless of their form, become crushed by the giant gravitational force. The gravitational force that the Sun is known to have is so great that it would compress atomic gases to a density 150 times denser than liquid water. It requires a long stretch of the imagination for such a phenomenon to be acceptable. In order for the impossible to be deemed plausible, exotic principles are imagined to exist, based on the assumption, under the doctrine, that the Sun is a gas sphere that burns hydrogen into helium in exotic nuclear reactions inside its core. The moment when doctrines require that one sets reality aside, exotic epicycles become necessary to rescue the doctrines, like Ptolemy's epicycles in ancient times. But even then, it becomes impossible to see the cause of the gigantic features that the ice cores tell us of. In solar physics, science is presently more deeply tied into knots than astronomy had been in the age of the epicycles. The currently accepted model of the Sun reflects the doctrine of entropy, by which everything in the universe exists in isolation, self-powered, self-existing, and self-consuming. The existence of streams of plasma and electric energy pervading cosmic space, by which the universe is actively powered, is not allowed to be recognized. The current model of the Sun has been forged on the basis of imposed assumptions rather than actual reality. The reason for this may be fear. If it ever came to be recognized in society that cosmic space is filled with vast electric power streams that interconnect the cosmos and actively power every galaxy and every sun, and that these are available on Earth for humanity, empires would fall that depend for their existence on their private ownership of the world's energy resources, and so on. It may have been for this reason that as soon as the electric universe theory was put onto the table of humanity by the Swedish electrical engineer, plasma physicist, and winner of the 1917 Nobel Prize in Physics, Hannes Alfvén, for his work on magnetohydrodynamics, that the Big Bang theory was developed as a counter-theory. This is likely the reason why it is nearly impossible in our time to formulate a rational ice age theory, since the electro-astrophysical basis for it is thereby denied to exist, so that the entire subject is left hanging, as if it was irrelevant. Science plays with epicycles in solar physics by the doctrine imposed on it that plasma in space does not exist, that plasma streams do not exist, that electric plasma interactions do not happen, that an electrically powered Sun is therefore not possible. Thus science is being put to the task in solar physics to relate all observed phenomena to a platform that doesn't actually exist, that is based on the fantasies that are left when reality is disallowed. Today's solar physics is stuck in the same prison that Ptolemy was stuck in, to explain scientifically what does not exist, for which exotic epicycle theories become invented to maintain the imprisonment. How do we get out of the paradoxical trap? We get out of the trap, like Johannes Kepler did in astronomy, by stepping away from the doctrines to exploring what is actually real. Some people did this half a century ago. They designed a mission in the early days of the American space program that would launch a spacecraft into a wide polar orbit around the Sun to measure the Sun's electric characteristics, such as its solar wind speed, pressure, temperature, density, and so on, outside the ecliptic plane, where electric measurements are distorted by the heliospheric current sheet that flows there. The mission was named Ulysses. The Ulysses spacecraft was launched from the shuttle Discovery on October 6, 1990. In order to reach high solar latitudes, the spacecraft was aimed close to Jupiter, so that Jupiter's large gravitational field would accelerate the spacecraft out of the ecliptic plane to high solar latitudes. The encounter with Jupiter occurred 14 months later, on February 8, 1992. The Ulysses satellite flew 3 orbits around the Sun perpendicular to the ecliptic. The first orbit began when the spacecraft encountered Jupiter in February 1992. The resulting first orbit was completed 6 years later, in February 1998. The third orbit began 6 years after that in February 2004. The spacecraft was turned off in August 2008, 4.5 years into the last orbit. What we got back as data from the satellite gives us the first physically measured verification that the Sun is not an internally heated fusion-powered star, but is an electrically powered star. What the Ulysses spacecraft has measured conforms with the physically observed geometric characteristics of magnetically self-shaped plasma observed in high-energy plasma flow experiments. If the Sun was an internally heated star, the abrupt loss of solar wind in the polar region should not occur, but with it being powered by focused plasma streams, focused by the natural electromagnetic geometry inherent in plasma flows, as they were observed at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, one finds the lack of the solar wind in the Sun's polar region not surprising. But one finds it as a confirmation of principles that have been experimentally observed. The measured verification by the Ulysses spacecraft of a fundamental principle in plasma physics, physically detected to be operating on the large scale in cosmic space, places the Sun into an entirely different category than that of an internally heated self-powered star. It places the Sun into the science category of high-energy plasma physics as an electrically powered star. The verified agreement in principle also solves an otherwise mythical paradox, the paradox of the orbital ecliptic. The laboratory experiment illustrates the principle of the ecliptic geometry of the solar system as a whole. Gravity mass orbital mechanics cannot explain why the planets of the solar system, including the asteroid belts, orbit within an ecliptic plane. No reason exists in gravity mass orbital mechanics why planets cannot orbit in a polar orbit around the Sun, or in any other orbit. The official excuse for this is that the planets were formed in an accretion disk spun off by the Sun's rotation. This mechanistic tale doesn't explain, however, why the composition of the planets is vastly different from that of the Sun, and from each other in many cases. The inconsistency tells us that the planetary ecliptic has evidently a different origin, one that reflects the ecliptic principle observed in high-energy plasma flow experiments. Here, an electrically created magnetic phenomenon forms an ecliptic ring between the two bolt-type magnetic structures that become formed in high-energy plasma experiments. The figure shown here illustrates the experiment-derived geometry of a rarely observed natural process, but which is evident by its effects. The planetary ecliptic comes to light as the logical extension of the experiment-observed effects. An example on the principle involved with the ecliptic plane superimposed is visible on the very large scale in the Red Square Nebula, an enormously powerful plasma flow magnetic structure. The plasma researcher David Lapointe was also able to replicate the ecliptic effect on the smallest scale in numerous static experiments with non-magnetized steel balls and two bolt-type magnets of opposite polarity as they are being formed in the high-energy experiments. The same magnets were further used to explore the plasma concentration features of the bolt-type magnetic fields, which in cosmic space would form a sphere of highly concentrated plasma around the center, where a Sun would be. In this dynamic experiment, a rotating ecliptic feature begins to form. By correlating experiment-derived phenomena and satellite-observed cosmic phenomena, we begin to work ourselves out of the mythological trap of the self-powered, internally heated Sun as an isolated star. This is critical because the science mythology trap has the potential to be a death trap for humanity, as it prevents the recognition of the actual ice age dynamics and the further recognition of the near start of the next ice age, whereby the trap blocks the preparations that are required for the continued existence of humanity in an ice age world. The measurement that Ulysses sent back also opened up another paradox that shouldn't exist if the Sun was an internally heated fusion star. Ulysses tells us that the electric energy environment in the solar system has been diminishing by 30% in the years between its first and third orbits. The largest diminishment, as highlighted in the white circle, occurred at the time before the satellite was turned off. This large diminishment in so short a time shouldn't have been possible while the sun's radiated energy had remained at a constant level throughout this time. But it happened. What does this mean? How would it be possible that the solar wind diminishes so dramatically while the sun remains fully powered to within its normal small fraction of a percent? Solving the impossible paradox before us. The solar winds are diminishing while the sun remains constant. By looking deeper into the past, one can notice that the systemic weakening that Ulysses had measured is actually not a new phenomenon. A general weakening had began already more than 3,000 years ago, with ups and downs along the way, according to what we can glean from ice core samples drilled from the Greenland ice sheet. The Ulysses satellite tells us, however, that the weakening has dramatically increased in modern time. The measured 30% reduction of the solar wind pressure over a span of 10 years is huge. The entire heliosphere that surrounds the solar system at a distance equal to 100 times the distance of the Earth to the Sun is getting measurably weaker as the result of the diminished solar wind. Because the heliosphere that forms around the Sun, at a great distance where the solar wind is coming to a halt, creates a shell of plasma at the wind's termination zone that shields the solar system against galactic cosmic radiation, we should see an increase of galactic cosmic radiation getting through. As the result of the shielding getting weaker, the heliosphere attenuates the incoming galactic cosmic ray flux. When the heliosphere gets weaker, more of the galactic radiation flux gets through. NASA's Ulysses satellite has measured, correspondingly, a 20% increase in galactic radiation. This is precisely what one would expect as the result of the weakening of the solar winds. Thus, with two measured items of evidence supporting one another, the measurements tell us that the electrodynamic weakening of the solar system is real, and is fast progressing. But why isn't this electric weakening reflected in a weaker sun, when the sun is electrically powered? Does the paradox disprove the electric sun theory? No, it doesn't disprove it. It proves it. It adds one more item of proof. The proof lies in what the solar wind represents. In electroastrophysics, the solar wind comes to light as a feature of a regulating system that maintains the operation of the sun at a tightly controlled level of intensity. The solar wind phenomenon may be seen in terms of a tea kettle. The kettle is placed on a stove. The heat is on high. The kettle is venting off steam as it boils. It is elementary in chemistry that it is not possible to heat the water in the kettle to a temperature hotter than the boiling point. If one turns up the flame, the water in the kettle doesn't get hotter. The extra energy is devoted to producing more steam. In the electrodynamics of the cosmic system that powers our sun, the solar wind can be likened to steam being boiled off from a kettle. The solar wind is the excess plasma that the regulating system lets go. The regulating feature keeps the sun at a steady temperature. This means that when the input plasma density around the sun diminishes, only the solar winds diminish, while the sun itself remains constant in its operation. This means that the solar wind pressure can be used as a measure of the effective power density in the supply line that is feeding into the sun at its reactive surface. In this comparison, the solar wind is the steam that flows from the kettle. If one turns the flame up, the kettle boils faster, and a stronger stream of steam comes out of it. If one turns the flame down, a weaker stream of steam results. By turning the flame down still further, one gets to the point when no steam at all is being produced. Should one reduce the flame even more, the water would get colder in the kettle. Below the boiling point, the temperature of the water diminishes with the energy input. This comparison is significant. Ulysses has measured 30% less steam coming from the sun over the span of 10 years. Now, 5 years further down this path, that solar wind pressure is likely reduced by 45% from what it had been in 1992 when the measurement started. 15 years from now, in the 2030 time frame, the steam flow will likely have diminished by a total of 90%. This means that we will have only 10% left then. And still, even at this highly diminished stage, we won't likely see the slightest change in the sun's energy radiation intensity. Only when the input energy drops below the point where solar winds are no longer ejected will the sun itself begin to diminish. This fading would happen progressively from the 2030 timeframe onward. The sun would still function at this point, but with a diminished intensity. When we get to this point, the weakening of the input streams would of course continue. This means that we might not have much time left at this point to the sun becoming inactive completely. When the supply factor gets interrupted, the entire plasma-powered system begins to collapse. The magnetic dynamic flow geometry is a function of the intensity of the flow. When the flow is diminishing, the geometry reshapes itself accordingly. When the reshaping affects the dynamic functioning of the system, a threshold point will be reached when the entire interlock structure can no longer be maintained and vanishes, as if it had never existed. When this happens to the supply system of the sun, which powers its reactive system, the sun will go inactive. It will become a dim star that glows by its residual energy and some nuclear decay within it. The energy output of the inactive sun would likely reflect what we presently are able to measure in the umbra of the sunspots. This tells us that the residual energy level of the sun would be roughly 30% of its active level that we presently enjoy. At the inactive energy level, agriculture would still remain possible in the equatorial region. This means that most of the world's agriculture will have to be relocated to there. Since little land exists in the tropics, agriculture will have to be put afloat across the equatorial sea on infrastructures that do not yet exist. 2 sea bridges will have to be built, roughly 500 kilometers wide, along the equator, between the continents, as a new place for the agriculture that can no longer be maintained in the regions that become uninhabitable by the cold. These infrastructures will have to be built to maintain the existence of humanity. The building is not optional. The materials exist for the building. And likewise the technologies and the energy resources. But will humanity do what is necessary and do it in time? This becomes a spiritual question. The principles that have been discovered tell us that the potential exists for the electromagnetic fields to collapse that prime the sun with its highly concentrated sphere of plasma that surrounds it. The observed rate of diminishment, measured by the Ulysses satellite, projected forward in time in a linear manner, suggests that the sun may go inactive in the 2050 time frame, with a source for that being located in the diminishing plasma streams in interstellar space. Far outside the solar system itself, the human capability is far too limited to master the large cosmic events in interstellar space. But we do have the capability to master ourselves and best arouse ourselves to upgrade ourselves towards the requirements of the future, which we are able to forecast by the dynamics of the causative principles instead of events. We are perfectly able to know with great certainty that we will kill our children, and ourselves likewise, if the infrastructures will not be created to place most of the world's agriculture into the tropics before the next ice age begins, which may happen in 30 years' time. Most of the world's agriculture lies presently in the zone that becomes uninhabitable when the ice age begins, or at best, becomes useless for agriculture. Without the continued operation of agriculture, where most of the world's food originates, humanity will simply perish by starvation. This needs to be avoided. The harsh conditions in the world, under an inactive sun, may have been the reason why only 1 to 10 million people had survived through the last ice age, worldwide. That's all we had after more than 2 million years of human development. The climate conditions that have placed this immense chokehold on humanity will be upon us potentially in the 2050s. The Ice Age chokehold may have been a major contributing reason why the 7 previous human species have all become extinct. Of course, we cannot predict the future rate of the energy diminishment in the solar system. The current rate of diminishment could slow down, or it could accelerate. The effects could become manifest faster or unfold slowly. This means that we cannot orient the existentially critical world development against potential events. Event-driven reactions are dangerous traps. Economic policy systems must become principle-oriented. We cannot predict events, but we can understand the principles and the dynamics that are in operation by which events occur. With being guided by the imperatives of known principles, it becomes possible that preparations for the critical events are made before the events occur, whenever this may be. If the known principles project an existential danger, then by responding to the principles, we eliminate the danger. With any lesser approach, we effectively lay ourselves down to die, possibly even before the Ice Age transition begins. Multi-level regulated astrophysical systems can only be understood in terms of principles because it is in the nature of multi-level regulated systems to prevent potential events. This means that everything looks normal for the end process until all the reserves at the various levels are depleted. The first level regulating stage, that may be as large as the entire inner solar system, holds large volumes of plasma in reserve to smooth out supply fluctuations. This regulation effect keeps the fluctuations averaged to long trends to prevent shock events. It may be able to average 100-year periods, but not the very long trends. The second level regulating system is the large plasma reservoir, that is the Sun's corona, which is several times larger in volume than the Sun itself. It appears to be gravity-held. It likely prevents the solar system's 22-year resonance cycle from affecting the radiation intensity in the visible light band. The 22-year resonance cycle, divided into 2 11-year solar activity cycles, has been explained by David Lapointe as a cyclical change of magnetic dominance between the upper and lower primer fields that determines the effective alternating magnetic polarity of the Sun at the center between the two fields. This means that the magnetic field of the Sun is an induced phenomenon that originates with the primer fields. When the Ulysses spacecraft measured the reduction of the underlying magnetic field of the Sun by 30% over the 16 years of its mission, it gave us a measurement of the overall weakening of the primer fields during its time frame. This may be the only direct measurement we have been able to glean of the intensity of the system of the primer fields. The third regulating system maintains the plasma pressure in the magnetic confinement dome of the reaction cells where the fusion reactions take place and the solar wind originates. The solar wind can therefore be seen as the final thermometer of the health of the system. When the wind diminishes to zero, big events will likely follow. The Little Ice Age in the 15th to 18th century was likely such an event. The next big event on the diminishing slope may be the terminal event that ushers in the Big Ice Age as the system stops functioning and the Sun goes inactive. If the principle becomes understood, preparations will be made for it. When the principle is understood, most of the world's agriculture will be relocated into the tropics along the equator onto networks of floating modules 1,000 kilometers wide, spanning the seas between the continents, connected with floating bridges, service from floating industries, and floating cities with free housing. As an investment by society into itself. Then, when the event happens, as it will by its own timing, it becomes a non-event. On this platform of understood principles, humanity as a whole becomes uplifted by its own creative power. And this power already exists as a latent resource for a new age. Ironically, the physical construction element appears to be the smallest part of the challenge that we need to master in the near future in order to survive the changing physical environment. The larger part of the challenge is spiritual in nature. Here the question comes to the surface: will we do what needs to be done? Will we become sufficiently human to support one another in universal love, for the general welfare of all humanity, meeting the common aims of mankind, including the aims for continuous development? Or will we remain stuck in the current smallness of thinking and encumbered relationships, universal isolation, and privatization into poverty, and worse, especially at the grassroots level where the living of humanity unfolds? I have created a series of 12 novels, The Lodging, For the rose to explore the challenges involved towards a wider sense of loving, reflecting the historic principle of universal love as a counterpole against the long ages of inhibiting conventions for an escape to greater freedom and creative power with the dynamics of the human heart and soul. We need this exploration in order to develop the dynamics in loving universally which an advancing world requires. And this is not a small thing. It soon became apparent that this project couldn't be done with a single novel. Consequently, the story was continued and expanded into a long series. I had thought at the time that the principle could be explored sufficiently with the addition of one more volume. Instead, enabling a closure, the additional volume opened numerous doors for moving forward. As the challenge widened, new principles brought greater freedoms, but also larger challenges with them, which no one had dared to tackle before, much less to win. The very notion of winning suddenly came to light as a complex of concepts that has countless dimensions, many remaining unclear, with the future still shrouded. And so, the kaleidoscope keeps turning. This time in Russia. What are peace, grace, love, against the horrors of war, rape, and the pains of impotence? Is the earth really flat? Some say it is. Some prove that it is. But for those whose bus got stuck in mud, there is still hope. Hope is rooted in a Christmas present of science that sets up a higher stage. A miracle unfolds in India, a universal marriage in the land of the deepest caste division, deeper than sexual isolation and religious isolation, flowing with daring commitments, without playing games. Why would small games continue to dominate the giant that the human being is? Just as the heart needs healing. And science does so likewise, the continent of Africa needs healing. And humanity with it. The truly endless horizons are the horizons of our own creating. In Caracas, a daring attempt is made to deny servitude and to master the future with ideas sown into the winds of time, so that the winds may change. Still, the world grinds on. Are there lessons to be learned, lessons from the masters of spiritual science, who have in their season caused the winds of war to be still? The cupbearer to the king is a dangerous pawn. He has many names. From this shadow he serves a cup of poison, seen in Siberia, located in space, a killer of millions, while not a soul cares to raise a finger to stop it, save a nameless patriot. When people must flee the land of the free, China opens a home for healing. A portal for a justified hope, while the healing continues. Hope is justified still, even on the Ice Age front. The more we discover of the truth, the stronger we will become in mastering the power to meet the challenge, both in the spiritual and the physical realm. We live in a universe of vast electric power, but before we can use it, we need to acknowledge that it actually exists. Someday we will do this. When we stop to keep our mental horizon blocked with paradoxical illusions, especially in the sciences, we will find that we have truly infinite horizons before us, both in terms of the critical freshwater resources that we need, and in energy resources more than we can yet imagine, which are all real. You are invited here, as the video closes, to come and visit the great libraries created for many more explorations of numerous topics, in the form of ebooks, videos, and stories from the novels. Oh, yes, great challenges lay before us, as we have the next ice age on the near horizon, in possibly 30 years, and we have the foregrounds threatened with nuclear war, depopulation policies, choke science, and economic collapse, and so on. But we also have the greatest force on our side to overcome these threats and move forward towards meeting the Ice Age challenge. It is appropriate in this context that this video ends with a multifaceted celebration of our humanity that unfolds in the final 7 chapters of my series of 12 novels, The Lodging. For the Rose, focused onto the principle of universal love. While the Ice Age isn't even mentioned there, the grand human dimension is summarized these chapters extensively in all its facets, which will enable us to meet even the greatest challenges that the present and the future may bring. Perhaps, someday we will live up to who and what we already are, and discover us as the brightest diamonds in the sky. Of course, when we get to this recognition, finally, and we will get there, the achievement will then likely be a non-event, as nothing else makes any sense then, except to be what we are.